She came through my gate on the first day of the silence, and not one of the 406 people standing in my hall said her name aloud, because a name spoken in Drumhello in winter can put 40 feet of snow on a sleeping child. They bowed instead, 406 people bending at the waist in a courtyard packed with new powder, and the only sounds in the world were the horses breathing and the leather of her saddle and the small, dry crush of my own boots as I came down the steps to meet the woman my treaty had bought. She was not what I had prepared myself for. I had prepared myself for a girl. Fenlo had lost a war and lost a valley, and the men who lose valleys send daughters, and daughters arrive frightened, and a frightened person makes noise. I had ordered the drum watched all that day for exactly that reason. 16 wolves were lying out on the hanging field above us with their bellies flat to the crust, feeling for the settle, and if she had wept out loud on my threshold, I do not know what I would have done. She did not weep. She swung down off a gray mare into snow that took her to the knee, and she took in my hall and my banners and the mountain standing over all of it like a raised hand. And then she looked at the crowd bent double in front of her and understood, in less time than it takes to say it, that they had not bowed out of love. She put her hood back so they could see her face while they did it. I have thought about that a great deal since. She was cold, she was 4 days from home. She had been handed across a table like a bag of salt, and her first act in my country was to make certain that the people bowing to her got a good look at who they were bowing to. My steward stepped forward with a slate. That is how we speak, from first frost to thaw. Wax over pine, a bone stylus on a cord, a scrape blade to take the words off again. Everyone above the age of 6 carries one. It hangs at the belt where other countries hang a knife. The children learn their letters early in Drumhello, and they learn them fast, because in winter a child who cannot write cannot ask for water. Nim Sedge, my slate keeper, 60 years old, hands like knotted rope, held out the welcome she had cut that morning. I had approved it. It was correct. It named the treaty, it named the peace. It named the woman as Ylva Wren of Fenlo, and it named her from this hour, the affianced of the Alpha King of Drumhello. Ylva read it standing in the snow. She read it twice. Then she took her own slate off her belt, a poor thing, cracked at one corner, the wax gone amber with age, and she wrote. And she turned it around and held it up not to me, but at the height of her own face so that the front rows could read it too. Does anything here make a sound? I had 100 answers. I had the whole of the law, which I had spent 11 winters enforcing. I had the ledger of the years before the law, the winters when we still rang bells, and what those bells cost us, and the names of the 230 people the drum has taken out of this basin since my great-grandfather's time. I took Nim's stylus. I wrote 3 words on the corner of her cracked slate because there was no room on mine. Nothing until spring. She looked at that for a long moment. She had gray eyes, and the cold had made them water, and she let it, because a tear is not a sound. Then she nodded once, and put the slate back on her belt without scraping it clean, and walked past me into my hall, and I stood in the courtyard with my hand still out and the low bell tolling in my skull. It had begun the moment she crossed under the gatehouse arch. I want to be exact about this, because everything that came after turns on it, and because I have never told it to anyone but a physician and, eventually, to her. It was not a feeling. I know what a feeling is. It was a sound. A bell struck once somewhere under the floor of my mind, and then again slow at the pace of a walking horse, the deep, drowned note of a great bronze bell rung underwater, so far down that what reaches you is not the ring but the shape of the ring. It had no direction. It did not come from my ears. When I put my hands over them, it went on tolling. And it grew louder as she came nearer. That I learned in the first hour. When she was across the hall from me, it was a thing I could set aside, like a pain in a tooth I had decided to ignore. When she stood at my elbow to be shown her rooms, it filled my head so completely that I could not follow the words on the slate Nim was holding up in front of my eyes. A king in the one country on the earth where noise is a capital crime, carrying a bell in his head. I sent for Canon Ardle that night. He is my physician and he is honest, which is the only quality I require of him. He looked into my eyes and down my throat and asked me, on wax, whether the sound came with headache, with weakness, with a smell of burning. No, I wrote, only when she is close. He scraped my answer off before he wrote his own. That is a courtesy in this country. He wrote, fever of the ear. It will pass. Rest and do not fret over it. And do not, he added, underlining twice, write that word to anyone else. Which word? Word. He was not being cruel. He was being a physician in a court, and courts read slates. That is the thing that outsiders never understand about the silence. They imagine it as peace. They imagine 90 days of snow and stillness and men nodding gravely at one another. It is not peace. It is a country where every word you say to anyone is written down, in your own hand, in front of witnesses, and then scraped away by a servant who read it while she scraped. There is no such thing as a private word in a Drumhello winter. There is only a word not yet read. That is the law I had to court my wife under. The clause was in the treaty at Fenlo's own asking, which I have always thought was the cruelest thing her people did to her, though they meant it kindly. Their envoys did not trust me. Why would they? I had broken their dam. I had not meant to break their dam. My engineers had cut a channel to feed our lower mills, and the channel took the frost, and the frost took the wall, and the wall took the town of Underfen, and there are 17 roofs under that water now, and Ilva Wren grew up watching the water eat her own street 1 house a year. I owed them a valley. I could not give them a valley. I gave them water rights, timber, the tithe of the upper mills, and a peace sealed with a marriage, because that is what my council understood and what theirs did. But Fenlo's envoys had a horror of sending a woman into a hold where she could not scream. So they wrote a clause. The marriage was not a marriage until the vow was spoken aloud by me by voice in the open on the first day of the thaw before the assembled hold. Not written, not signed, spoken. And if the Alpha King did not speak the vow, if he found her wanting, if he changed his mind, if he simply stood there in the spring sun with his mouth shut, then the woman went home, unshamed, unbound, and Drumhello forfeited the water rights and the mills and the tithe forever. It was meant as her shield. It meant that no man in my hall could touch her, disrespect her, or presume upon her, because until the thaw she was not mine at all. She was a guest with an army behind her. And it meant that for 90 days she would live inside a law that forbade me to say one word to her, at the end of which she would stand in front of 406 people, and find out, by listening, whether she was being kept or sent back. Fenlo gave her that, and then they went home. I read the clause the night she arrived, sitting alone with a candle, hearing the bell. I could have written to her. I could have taken a slate and cut, "I will speak the vow, do not be afraid, I have no intention of sending you back." It would have taken me 30 seconds, and it would have cost me nothing. It would also have been read by Nim Sedge, who scrapes my slates, and by the 2 clerks who file the wax shavings, because in a court where the record is wax, shavings are evidence. And by Holt Marem, my silence warden, who has the right by law to read any slate in the hold at any hour without asking. A right I gave him myself, and a right I have never once regretted until that winter. And every one of them would have carried it within a day to the men on my council who had opposed the treaty, who had said, "Give her a season, and if the girl proves a fool or a spy or barren or loud, we take the clause and we keep the mills." If I wrote her a promise in the first week, she would spend the winter being watched by men who knew exactly how much I could be made to pay. So I wrote nothing. That is the first thing I did to her, and I did it out of care, and it was still the first thing I did to her. Understand what a Drumhello winter is, because the whole of what happened is inside it. The drum is a mountain, but that is not the right word for it. It is a great tilted plate of rock, a mile across, and every autumn the snow builds on it in layers the way a candle builds wax, and by midwinter there are 20 feet of snow lying on that plate at an angle, and under the top layers there is old snow, and between the layers there is sometimes a weakness, a crust of hoar, a plain of ice, a seam of grit blown in from the eastern passes, and the whole hanging field waits, held up by nothing but friction and luck. Sound will not by itself bring a slab down. Any wolf warden will tell you that. It is not the shout. It is that the slab was going anyway, and the shout is what you remember. But we have buried people because of it, or near enough, and my great-grandmother wrote the law and I keep it. Because when the choice is between silence and 100 coffins, you choose silence, and you do not argue with your own grandchildren about the physics of it. So from first frost until the thaw day, no voice above a breath, no bells, no horns, no hammer on the anvil above a rap tap. No hound may bark, the dogs are muzzled in felt and hate it, doors are hung on leather, the mills stand still, the forge burns but does not ring. Children are carried to school so their boots do not squeak on the crust. And every soul in the hold walks around wearing a little wooden board on a cord, cutting the day's business into wax, scraping it away, cutting it again. We are not a mournful people. Two things you would not expect. Drumhello laughs more in winter than in summer because a joke you must write down and hold up is a better joke, and because a hall of 400 people shaking with silent laughter is a thing that will stay with you until you die. And we sing all summer everywhere badly. We are the loudest country in the north from thaw to frost. We spend 6 months hoarding sound like grain. And the wolves. There were 16 of the slope pack that year. They are not sacred. Nobody in Drumhello will tell you a wolf is an omen, and any wolf warden who caught a farmer saying so would take him up the drum by the ear. They are working animals, and their work is this. They lie out on the hanging field in the cold for hours with their bodies flat to the crust, and they feel what a man cannot feel. They feel the settle. They feel the slab talking to itself. A wolf that has been lying easy on the slope and then stands up, walks 4 steps downhill, and looks back over its shoulder has told you that the field is going to move, and you have between 1 hour and 1 day. The record of it is in my archive, kept since my great-grandmother, and it is not superstition. It is a ledger, and the ledger says that in 91 years the slope pack has been right 288 times. They had never been wrong, not once in 91 years. I want that written down carefully. They had never been wrong about the snow, they knew. The eldest of them was Brack. He was old that winter and gray to the muzzle, and he had a bad hip, and he had walked down off the drum 11 times in his life, and 11 times the field had come down behind him. Holt Maram, who is not a sentimental man, had once been found asleep in the wolf run with his head on Brack's flank, and had scraped his own slate so fast when he saw me that he cut his thumb. She met the wolves before she met me properly, which is to say before either of us had said a single word to the other in a voice. 6 days after her arrival, I came up to the wolf run in the blue hour before dawn and found her sitting on the frozen bench outside it with her cloak over her knees, and Brack lying against the rail on the other side of the bars with his spine along the wood, the way he liked, and the young bitch Syl, 2 years old, the best nose in the pack and no sense at all, with her nose pushed through the rails into the crook of Ilva's elbow. Holt Maram was standing 10 feet off with his arms folded, and an expression on his face I had never seen there. Ilva stood when she saw me. Everyone stands. She took out her slate. They let me sit, she wrote. I took out mine. This was the 6th day, and I had said nothing to her that was not ceremonial, and I had a whole page of ceremony ready. I wrote, Brack lets no one sit. She read it, and she did the thing I would come to wait for all winter, the thing that made the 90 days bearable and unbearable. She did not smile with her mouth. Her eyebrows moved very slightly one before the other, and something happened behind her eyes, and it was a laugh, and it made no noise at all, and there was not a soul alive who could have written it down. She turned her slate over and used the back. He is old, and I am cold, and neither of us can shout. It is a small friendship, but it is the only one on offer. I stood there in the dark with the bell going in my head like a hand knocking on a door under the sea, and I could not answer her, because everything I wanted to write would have been read at the council table by noon. I wrote, you may sit with them whenever you wish. Nim Sedge scraped it off my slate an hour later and filed the shavings, and I have no doubt at all that it was reported to Councillor Tass as, the king grants the Fenlo woman the freedom of the wolf run, and that Tass wrote in the margin of his own private wax, he is softening. He was right, but he had it backwards. It was not that I had begun to soften toward her. It was that I had been carrying a bell in my skull for 6 days and had begun, God help me, to want to know what she thought about things. Here is our courtship. There was no other kind available. She wrote me a question every morning. I do not know when she decided to do it or why. I never asked and she never explained, and by the 3rd week I was awake before the bell hour waiting for it. Why is the hall built facing the mountain instead of away from it? Because a wall with its back turned is a wall that gets hit in the back. Because we watch the thing that can kill us. We have always watched it. Who taught the wolves? Nobody. They came to it themselves in the years when they hunted this basin, and the field came down on them too. The wardens only learned to read what they were already saying. My great-grandmother wrote, we did not train them. We apologized to them, and then we listened. What is the greatest number of days the silence has ever run? 104, the year of the long frost. 2 children born in it who did not hear a human voice until they were 3 months old. They were fine. They were, if anything, unusually calm children. Do you like it? I looked at that one for a long time. No, I wrote, I have kept the silence for 11 winters and I have never once liked it. I keep it because the alternative is a shovel. She read that in the corridor outside the muniment room, standing under a lamp with her hood down and snow melting in her hair, and she looked up at me with an expression I could not read at all. Then she wrote on her own slate, "Thank you for not pretending," and scraped it clean herself, and gave me my slate back and went to her rooms. I stood in that corridor for some while afterward. I am told by everyone who has ever served me that I am an exact man, a cold man, a man who governs the way a cooper fits a barrel, and I have never resented the description because it is true, and because a basin under a hanging field does not want a passionate king. But it had been a long time since anyone had thanked me for not pretending, and it had never once happened in silence, and the bell in my head was ringing so loudly by then that I had begun to hear it in my sleep. By the 4th week I was writing to her twice a day. By the 6th I had begun a habit that I have never confessed to anyone alive except her, and that shames me even now. At night, when Nim had gone to bed and the tower was dark, I would take a fresh slate, a clean one, off the shelf, not my day slate, and I would sit at the window with the drum standing white against the black, and I would write her the truth. There is a bell in my head, and it began when you rode under my gate, and it has not stopped once in 41 days. Ardle says fever. It is not fever. I know what my own body is doing, and my body is doing nothing. It is a bell. It is nearer when you are nearer. I have never in my life wanted to hear a sound so much as I want to hear you say anything at all. I do not know what color your voice is. Tass wants me to keep the mills and send you back. He has not said so on wax. He does not need to. 3 men on my council believe I am a fool who has been softened by a gray-eyed woman with a cracked slate, and they are right about the slate. If I write to you that I will speak the vow, they will read it, and they will know that I will pay any price at all to keep you, and then they will name the price, and it will be Fenlo's water. So I will say nothing until the thaw, and you will spend the winter thinking you are for sale. I am sorry. I am sorrier than I have ever been about anything I have done as king, including the channel and the dam and the 17 roofs. And then, because a slate left lying in wax is a slate that will be read, I would take each one and I would put it in a cedar box under my window seat, with a lock on it, and the key on the cord at my neck under my shirt, next to nothing else at all. 40 slates, 50. By the end I stopped counting. A box full of everything I could not say to a woman who was sitting 11 steps down the corridor in a country that would have killed us both if either of us had raised our voice. I told myself I was protecting her. That is what men like me always tell ourselves. It has the great advantage of being partly true. Her uncle came in the deep of it at midwinter, when the light in Drumhello is a gray stripe that arrives at 10 and goes at 3. Brannock Wren rode in with 6 men and a mule of accounts to inspect the peace, as was his right under the treaty. He was a heavy, courteous, careful man with the face of someone who has done a hard thing and made his peace with it, and would like very much for you to admire the peace he has made with it. He hated the silence. Watching him try to conduct an inspection, and it was, I will confess, the only entertainment I had that winter. He kept forgetting. He would open his mouth in the accounts room, and Holt Marram would step from the wall with one finger raised, and Brannock would go the color of an old brick and reach for his slate and stab at the wax with the stylus, breaking the point, and then have to sharpen it. And by the time he had sharpened it, he had forgotten what he was angry about, which I think did more for the peace between our countries than the treaty did. But on his 4th night, he cornered his niece in the gallery outside the great hall, and he did not know that the gallery has a stone bench in the shadow at the north end where the Alpha King sometimes sits when he wishes to be left alone. And I did not announce myself, and I have never decided whether I am ashamed of that. They wrote to each other. I could see the slates catching the lamplight, angled, turned, held up. I could not read them from there, but I could read her. She was very straight, my Ilva always, and I watched her go straighter and straighter, and then, at some particular slate, I watched her stop reading and stand looking at the wall over her uncle's shoulder for the space of 6 breaths. She did not weep. She lifted her chin the exact fraction I had seen her lifted in the courtyard with 400 people bent double in front of her. Then she wrote something short, 1 line, and held it up. He read it. He wiped it off with his thumb, which is a discourtesy so gross in this country that Holt Marram would have written a citation, and he walked away. She stood alone in the gallery for a while. She put her hand flat on the cold stone of the wall and leaned on it. Then she scraped her slate clean and went to bed. I sat in the dark with the bell tolling 7 feet from her and did nothing. In the morning I did what a coward does when he is also a king. I sent for the record. Not her slate, hers was hers. But Brannock had used a hold slate drawn from the guest room shelf, and it had gone back to the shelf unscraped. And Nim Sedge, who has never in her life failed to read a slate before she cleaned it, brought it to me with her mouth pressed flat. The wax held the last thing he had written before she gave him her one-line answer. Then earn him, you have until the thaw. Fenlo has no water if you cannot make a cold man speak. I looked at that for a long time in a room where I could not swear, could not shout, could not throw the thing across the room and hear it break. I have never in my life so badly wanted a noise. She did not come to the wolf run for 4 days after her uncle left. When she came back, she brought a rolled hide with her and a stick of charcoal, and she sat on the frozen bench and drew and would not show me. Syl put her nose in the crook of her arm. Brack lay against the rail with his eyes half shut and his gray muzzle on his paws, breathing the slow, deep breath of an old animal in the cold. And every so often his ear would turn a little without the rest of him moving, and Ilva would look up at the white field above us, and then down at her hide and draw. I sat on the other end of the bench, which is where a man sits when he has no words and has been forbidden the sound of his own voice. On the 5th day, she turned the hide around. She had drawn the drum, not as a mountain, as a diagram, cut through, the way an engineer draws a wall. She had drawn the layers of the snowfield as bands, one above another, with the old gray snow at the bottom and the new at the top, and she had marked the seams between them with small crosses. And beside it she had drawn a second thing in a different hand, an older hand copied from something. A hillside above a river, layered the same way with the same crosses. She wrote on her slate, "This is Fenlo, the bank above under Fen, my mother drew it." "I don't understand," I wrote. "Water and snow are the same material," she wrote. "They lie in layers, they hold on friction, and they let go on a plane. My mother could tell you 3 hours before the bank went, not by looking at the water, by the smell of the ground and the way the birds stopped and how the last dry leaf lay." I looked at the drawing. It was very good. It was so good that it took me a moment to be uneasy. "Your mother taught you to read a slope." "My mother taught me to read a slope that was wet," she wrote. "Everything in Fenlo is wet. Everything of yours is dry and frozen. I have been sitting here for 6 weeks learning what the difference is." She scraped it and wrote again. "Audrin, may I ask a question you will not like?" That was the first time she wrote my name. Only my name, no title. I have kept the memory of that slate more carefully than I have kept the treaty. "Ask. Your wolves lie on the crust and they feel the settle. They have been right 288 times. Yes. Have they ever been right about warm snow?" I did not answer at once. I sat on the frozen bench in a country where I could not speak, and I turned it over. "The ledger records 9 warm spells inside the silence in 91 years," I wrote. "In none of them did the field move." She read that. She looked up at the drum hanging over us, a mile of white plate tilted at the sky, and I saw her chest rise and fall once, deep, the way a person breathes when they have just decided that they are going to have to be brave about something. "So the pack has never been tested on it," she wrote. "And you have written down their record as if it were." I want to be honest about what I felt. I felt affront. 11 winters, 91 years, 288 readings, and not one error, and a woman from a drowned valley who had been in my country for 6 weeks was sitting on my wolf-run bench telling me that my ledger had a hole in it. And under the affront, immediately, before I had finished feeling it, the cold drop in the stomach of a man who governs a basin and has just been shown something true. Because it was true. 9 warm spells in 91 years, and the field had held through all 9, and we had written down the pack read it. The field held as though the pack's reading had been what held it. We had never had a warm spell that went bad. So we had never learned whether Brack could feel a wet slab. I looked at the old wolf, lying against the rail with his hip trouble and his graying muzzle, who had walked down off that mountain 11 times and been right 11 times, whom Holt Maram loved more than he loved most people, and who was at that moment with his eyes shut, the single most trusted instrument in my kingdom. I wrote slowly, what would a wet slab feel like to him? She wrote, "I don't know, that is the trouble. It might feel like nothing at all. Water lubricates. A wet slab does not talk to itself the way a cold one does. It does not creak and settle and warn. It sits perfectly still and perfectly quiet, and then it goes all at once, and it goes faster and it goes further because it is heavy." She scraped it clean and wrote one more line and turned it to me, and did not look away while I read it. "A cold slab groans, a wet one holds its breath." I gave her the archive. I did it quietly, and I did it wrong. I should have taken her to the council table and set the drawing in front of Tass and let her explain it in wax in front of men, who would then have had to write down their objections in their own hands. That is what I would have done for a mining captain or a road engineer. Instead, I unlocked the muniment room myself and put the 91 years of the ledger on the table and stood back, because Councillor Tass had spent the winter waiting for me to hand him something that looked like the Fenlow woman meddling in the defense of the hold, and I could not bear to hand it to him. So the woman who was about to save 406 lives did her work at night, in a cold room without any authority whatsoever, because her king was afraid of his own council. She worked for 11 days. She had a bad way of sitting, hunched, with her feet hooked round the chair legs. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. She kept a tally on her cracked slate and scraped it and recut it so many times that the wax went soft, and she had to hold it near the fire to smooth it. I brought her a lamp on the 4th night. On the 7th, I brought her a second stylus. On the 9th, I brought her bread and cold mutton because Nim had told me, with a face like a shut door, that the Fenlow woman had not come down to the hall for 2 days. And I set the plate at her elbow, and she did not look up. And I sat down across the table from her and read the treaty for the 11th time by the light of a lamp I had carried up 4 flights myself. At some point in that night, I looked up, and she had stopped writing and was watching me. She did not reach for her slate. Neither did I. We sat, the two of us, on either side of a table with a ledger on it, in a silence that was not the law's silence, and the bell tolled and tolled under my skull, very slow, very deep. A bronze note struck once and left to hang, and I thought, I would give up the mills. I would give up the water. I would give up the treaty, the tithe, the timber, and the whole Eastern March, and I would stand in the courtyard on thaw day and say the vow so loudly that the drum came down on my own head, and I have not one single way of telling you so. She reached across the table and turned my hand over and put 2 fingers against the inside of my wrist, on the pulse, the way a physician does. She held them there for the space of 10 beats. Then she took her hand back and picked up the stylus and went on reading the ledger. I do not know what she was listening for. I have never asked. She has never told me. On the 11th night she found it. I had fallen asleep in the chair. She woke me by putting the slate on the table in front of me and tapping the wood twice with the stylus, which is how you wake a person in this country. Year 44, she wrote, the warm spell of the 8th week. Your ledger says the field held. Yes. Read the Wolf Warden's marginal note. She had it open and had marked the place with a straw. The hand was small and cramped, and 2 generations dead. The pack would not go up. 3 days whipped them and they would not. Field held anyway, wardens embarrassed. I read it 4 times. Ilva wrote they were not wrong, they were afraid. A wolf can be afraid of a slope it cannot read, and your warden whipped them for it and wrote it down as an embarrassment. She scraped and wrote, Audrin, they don't know, that is the whole of it. Your wolves have told your wardens the truth 288 times about cold snow, and no one alive has ever seen them read wet snow. And the one time they were given wet snow, they lay down and refused to go up the hill. She stopped, she put the stylus down. Then she picked it up again and added, in a hand that was not quite steady, It has been thawing for 3 days. It had. I had noticed it the way you notice a good thing. The eaves had been dripping since the 2nd day. There was water running under the crust in the courtyard, and the children had been sliding on it, silently, delighted, until Holt Maram put a stop to it. In the Wolf Run, the snow had gone from powder to a heavy gray porridge that took a boot print and kept it. We call it the fall swarm. It comes most years in the deep of the silence, and it lasts a week and it goes and the frost comes back harder, and Drumhello has always taken it as a gift. A week of easy hauling. A week when the ice on the cistern can be broken with one blow. The drum had been sitting in it for 3 days with 22 feet of snow on its back. I went up to the wolf run at first light with Ilva behind me and Holt Maram coming out of the warden's hut with his shirt half-laced. And the 16 of them were lying out on the field exactly as they had lain every day of that winter. Lying easy, Brack with his spine along the rail, ears down, back leg twitching in a dream. Sill on her side in the wet snow with her paws in the air like a fool. Not one of them was standing. Not one of them was walking downhill. Not one of them was looking back over its shoulder. Every instrument in my kingdom was reading safe, and had been reading safe for 3 days, and a woman from a drowned valley was standing at my shoulder with her hood down and her nostrils flaring, smelling the air the way her mother had taught her to smell a riverbank, and I watched the color go out of her face. She reached for her slate. Her hands were shaking so badly that the first word came out illegible, and she scraped it with the flat of her thumb and cut it again. She turned the slate around. I read it standing in the gray light on the wolf run, with a bell tolling in my skull, in the one country in the world where a man who has just learned that his mountain is coming down on his people may not open his mouth and say so. It is holding its breath. End of Part 1, Words. By Part 1 done at roughly 6,600 words, honest count, no padding. Movement 1 and the whole of Movement 2 are on the page. We end on the pull. Part 2-6, 200 words takes it through. The silent evacuation of 406 souls, Holt Maram at the door with the law in his hand, Brack, the slab taking the tower and the cedar box, the 90 days ending, Brannock arriving to collect her, Audrin digging out a slate that has run blank, and the first sound of the thaw. Say continue and I'll write it, then paste both updated trackers, entry 13, in full continue thought for 44's thought for 44 SSDORY, Part 2. I have gone over the next 4 hours more times than I have gone over anything else in my life, and I still cannot tell you the order of the first 10 minutes. I know that I did not believe her at once. I want that on the record. I stood on the wolf run in the wet gray light with 16 wolves lying easy on the field above me and my whole ledger saying safe, and my first thought, the honest one, the one that came before the thinking, was, she is frightened of a mountain because a riverbank killed her town. That is what a careful man's mind does. It finds the reason the truth can be dismissed. It finds it fast, and it finds it kind, and it dresses it as compassion. I looked at the wolves. I looked at Holt Maram, half-laced, standing in the door of the warden's hut with his slate already in his hand because he had seen her face. And then I looked at the eaves of the hut and the water running off them, and the print my own boot had left in snow that should have been powder and was porridge. And I thought about a marginal note in a dead man's cramped hand. The pack would not go up. Whipped them and they would not. I took my slate. My hands were steady. They have always been steady. It is one of the few things about me that has never been of any use. I wrote how long. She read it and closed her eyes for a moment, and I understood that she had been praying I would argue, because if I argued she would have time to be wrong. Today she wrote, perhaps tonight, I would not sleep in the lower hold. Certainty. She scraped that off herself, which is a thing no subject may do to a king's slate, and she wrote across the whole width of the wax in letters an inch high. None, I have never been certain of anything in my life. The bank above UNDRFEN looked perfectly well on the morning IT went. And under it small. I only know it is wet and quiet, and that nobody here has ever seen it wet and quiet before. Holt Maram came up the path. He read her slate over my shoulder, which he had the right to do, and I watched a man who had spent 22 years on that mountain go the color of the snow he stood in. He wrote, the pack is easy, sire, the pack is easy. I know it. Brack has never once. I know it, Holt. He stood there with the stylus in his fist. Then he did the bravest thing I have ever seen a man do with a piece of wax. He turned and looked up at the field, and he looked at Brack lying against the rail dreaming, and he wrote. He is 14. He has never in his life put his belly on warm snow. And he scraped it clean, and he wrote orders and held it up. There is no alarm in Drumhello. You cannot understand what that sentence costs until you have had to stand in a courtyard and empty a town. No bell, no horn. No man running through the lanes shouting out, out, the field is coming. Every hold in the north has a bell for this, and we melted ours down 91 years ago and cast it into a set of door hinges. And my great-grandmother had the hinges hung on the muniment room, and I had walked through that doorway 10,000 times without once thinking about what it was. We have instead the order of the quiet muster, which is a document, and which had been read aloud precisely never, and drilled in my time twice badly in summer. It works like this. The warden writes the order on a hold slate and gives it to the 4 quarter wardens. Each quarter warden goes to the first house of her quarter, knocks twice on the door, 2 knocks, no more, felt more than heard, shows the slate, and hands the householder a wooden token. The householder wakes his house, dresses his children, takes the token, and goes to the next house and knocks twice and shows the token and gives it on. Every house passes it to the next. 406 people moving up the north stair to the high pasture in the dark on wet snow without one voice. And the flaw in it, the flaw my great-grandmother knew about and wrote about and could not solve, is that it is a chain, and a chain is only as good as its weakest link, and its weakest links are these: the deaf, the old, the sick, the drunk, the stubborn, the frightened, and the 4-year-old child who will not put her boots on and whose mother, at the 11th minute of a silent evacuation, will do the thing that a mother's whole body is built to do. She will say the child's name out loud. I gave the order at the 7th hour of the morning. I gave it standing in my own courtyard, and the first person I gave it to was not a quarter warden. It was Councillor Tass. He had come out of the hall in his furs with his breakfast in his hand because he had seen the wardens running, and he read Holt's slate, and then he read Ilva's drawing, which I had brought down under my arm, and he looked at me, and I saw the whole of his winter go across his face. He had spent 90 days building a case. He had every slate shaving filed. He had the Fenlow woman meddling in the archive without authority. He had the king carrying lamps up 4 flights at midnight. He had a hole in the ledger that she had opened, and that I had let her open in the dark alone because I was afraid of my own council table. If the field held, and the field had held 9 times in 91 years, he would have me in front of that table within the week, and he would be right. And if I did nothing and the field came down, there would be 406 people under it. And Tass would be right about that too, and neither of us would care, because we would be under it with them. He wrote very fast. The pack reads easy. I wrote, the pack has never read wet. He read that. He looked at the drum. He was not a wicked man. I have never had a wicked man on my council. I have had frightened ones, and men who loved the mills, and men who could not bear to be made a fool of, which in my experience is the most dangerous thing a man can be unable to bear. He wrote, if you empty the hold on a Fenlow woman's word and the field holds, you will never govern this basin again. I wrote, then I will not govern it. He stood there with his breakfast going cold in his hand. Then he scraped his slate with his sleeve, Tass, who had never in his life so much as unbuttoned his collar in public, and he wrote, give me the east quarter. My knees are better than Holt's. I have forgiven that man a great deal for 1 line of wax. It took 4 hours and 11 minutes. I did the north quarter myself, because the north quarter is the lower hold, and the lower hold is where the poor of Drumhello live, in houses built against the foot of the drum where the ground is level and the rent is nothing, and where every soul under that field would be under 40 feet of it. I want to tell you what a silent town looks like when it is being emptied. It looks like a dream you have had, doors opening in the dark and lamplight falling on wet snow. A man in his nightshirt with a token in his fist, running, not running, walking very fast, because we do not run on crust, to his neighbor's door and knocking twice with the side of his fist. Children carried, half asleep, wound in blankets, staring over their father's shoulders at the mountain. An old woman on a chair, lashed to 2 poles, borne up the north stair by her sons. 200 boots on wet snow make a sound like a hand rubbing cloth. That was all. 406 people leaving their houses forever, and the whole of it was a hand rubbing cloth. And at the 11th minute, in the lane below the tannery, Myra Sorrel could not find her daughter. I was 30 feet away. She had 4 children, and the youngest was 4 years old and had hidden, as 4-year-olds do, in the place she went to when she was afraid, which was under the bed with the dog. And Myra came out into the lane with 3 children on her and 1 missing, and I watched her whole body fill with the sound she was about to make. Ilva reached her first. She was not supposed to be in the lower hold at all. I had told her, written her, to go up with the first party, and she had ignored me, because it was her hole in the ledger, and she was not going to sit on a high pasture and watch it be tested. She got both hands on Myra Sorrel's face. Not over her mouth, I have thought about this, over the ears. She took the woman's head in her two hands and pressed her palms over both her ears and pulled her forehead down against her own, so that Myra Sorrel could hear nothing at all except her own blood, and could see nothing except a gray-eyed stranger, and could not scream, because a scream needs an ear to be going into, and there was none. She held her there for 4 breaths. Then she let go and picked up Myra's slate off the snow and wrote one word and turned it around. Where? And Myra Sorrel, who had lost a valley and gained a mountain, and had never in 90 days spoken one word to the king's foreign bride, wrote bed and dog. And they went in together and came out with a 4-year-old in her nightgown and a small furious terrier under Ilva's arm. And the terrier's muzzle was already on, because we muzzle every dog in the hold from first frost, and I have never been so glad of a law in my life. The child did not cry. Children in this country learn early. She looked back once at her house from her mother's shoulder, the way you look at something you will not see again. We got the last of them up the north stair by the 11th hour. I stood at the head of it and counted them past me, because a king counts. That is nearly the whole of what a king does. 401, 402. Nim Sedge, 71 years old, carrying the muniment key on a cord like an ornament of state. Canon Ardle with his bag. Brannock Wren's steward. Brannock himself had gone home a month before, and there is a mercy in that, because I do not think he could have kept silent, and I do not know what I would have done. 404, 405. 406 was Holt Maram, and he came up the stair last, and he came up alone, and I knew before he was 10 steps from me what he was going to write. The pack would not come down. They had lain easy all morning. They lay easy still. He had gone out on the field himself, and hauled at them, and they had looked at him with the mild, insulted patience of working animals being asked to do something at the wrong hour, and Syl had rolled over to have her belly rubbed. He wrote it on his slate and held it up, and his face did not move at all. They cannot feel it. It is not talking. They have nothing to hear. And then he wrote underneath, because he was a warden, and the warden writes the record. 16 Brack among them. I put my hand on his shoulder. There was nothing to say and no way to say it. That is the silence. It is not a peace. It is a country where a man's dog is dying on a mountain, and you cannot even tell him you are sorry without somebody scraping it into shavings and filing it. Ilva took his slate out of his hand. She scraped it clean with her thumb, and she wrote, and she gave it back to him, and I read it over his arm. They were not wrong. They were never wrong. Nobody ever asked them a question they could answer. Holt Maram read that. He read it twice. Then he pressed the slate against his chest, wax inward, so nobody could scrape it, and he stood at the head of the north stair looking up at the field, and that is where he was standing at 20 minutes past the 2nd hour of the afternoon when the drum let its breath out. I have heard men describe an avalanche as a roar. It is not a roar. A roar is a thing with a mouth. What came off the drum that afternoon had no mouth, and it made a sound I did not know the world contained. And the terrible thing, the thing I dream about, is how late the sound was. The field moved first. A mile of white plate slid 4 feet, altogether without any noise whatsoever, the way silk slides off a table. And then it stood up. That is the only way I can say it. 22 feet of wet snow came off the rock in one piece and stood up on its hind legs to twice the height of my tower and started down the basin, and the sound arrived afterward out of order, as though the mountain had had to remember how. It was low. That is what nobody tells you. It was so low that I felt it in my knees and in the ground and in my back teeth before I heard it in my ears, a great slow grinding under everything, and every soul on that high pasture, 406 of us, standing in wet snow with the tokens still in our fists, went absolutely, perfectly still. Nobody screamed. 90 days of the silence and 11 winters of my law and 91 years of my great-grandmother's law, and not one of them screamed. 406 people watched their town go under, and they made no sound at all, and I stood at the head of the north stair with a bell tolling in my skull that nobody else could hear. And I have never been so proud of anything, and I hope to God I am never that proud of anything again. It took the lower hold in 11 seconds. The tannery, the lane, Myra Sorrel's house with the bed and the print of a child under it. It came on across the flat, and it took the mills, and it took the long barn, and at the last it slowed and reared and put its shoulder against the north wall of my own tower, which my grandfather built to stand for 1,000 years, and the tower stood for the length of one breath, and then folded like a man sitting down. My window seat went into the snow. My window seat and the floor under it, and a cedar box with a lock, and a key on a cord round my neck that no longer opened anything at all. Then it stopped, and there was a silence of a completely different kind, and it went on and on. And then very far off, a dog barked. Muzzled, thin, ridiculous, absolutely against the law. Somebody's terrier under somebody's arm. I felt 400 people beside me not laugh. I felt it go through the crowd like a wave, the great silent shaking of a drum-hello joke, women with their hands over their mouths and their shoulders going, a boy on his father's back with his face screwed up in tears running, and Nim Sedge, 71, sitting down abruptly in the snow with her fist against her teeth. We had lost everything below the 5th Street. Not one soul, not one. Brack came down 2 days later. They found him on the eastern shoulder, where the slab had sheared and left a step, and how a 14-year-old wolf with a bad hip got himself onto that step nobody has ever been able to explain, and Holt Marram will not discuss it. 9 of the 16 came down over the next week. 7 did not. I will not make an omen of him. He was an old animal on a mountain, and the mountain moved, and he found a rock. And if he had not found a rock, he would be dead, and it would have meant precisely as much. But I stood in the wolf run in the last light of that week and watched Holt Marram, who had not wept when his own wife died, sit down in the wet snow and put his forehead against a gray muzzle, and I turned away and let him have it. And when Ilva came up to the rail, he did not scrape his slate, and he did not stand up. He just held out his hand to her without looking, and she took it, and the 3 of us stood there in the ruin of the best instrument in my kingdom. He wrote later, "We will lie out ourselves, the wardens, on the wet days. We will learn what it feels like." He has. It is 9 years now, and there are 11 wardens who can tell you what a wet slab feels like under a man's ribs, and every one of them learned it because a woman from a drowned valley read a marginal note by lamplight. We wintered on the high pasture, and in the upper hold, 406 people in a space built for 100, and it should have been dreadful, and it was not. I have never been so close to my own people. I had governed them for 11 winters from a tower and by wax, and now I slept in a hall with 200 of them, and Nim Sedge scraped my slate with the same blade she scraped the baker's. Tass ran the food. He was magnificent. He had a head for stores like nobody I have ever met, and he did it with his coat off. And when the Fenlow woman's tally slate proved to be the only accurate count of who was in which quarter, he sent for it and used it, and wrote at the bottom of his own return in his own hand, where anybody could read it. Count by Irene, correct in every particular. That is what he did instead of an apology, because he was a drumhello man, and it cost him more than an apology, and I let him keep the difference. The thaw was 31 days off. And in all that hall, with 200 people sleeping around us, we still could not speak, and now we could not even be alone in a corridor, and my box was under 60 feet of snow. I had written her 51 slates. I had counted them at last, in the counting of what was lost. 51 slates of everything true. The bell, the fever that was not a fever, the mills I would have given away, her uncle's line about earning a cold man, the 17 roofs of Underfen, the thing I had done to her on the first day out of care. Wax under 60 feet of wet snow, snow that packs to ice, ice that presses. She did not know any of it. She had spent 90 days in a country where she could not hear, married to a clause, being polite to a man who would not write her one word she could keep. I watched her that month. She was courteous to everyone. She sat with the children. She taught 11 wardens to smell a slope. She grew thin. And 9 days before the thaw, I came into the storeroom and found her sitting on a grain sack with her cracked slate on her knee and the stylus in her hand. And she was not writing. She was holding it and looking at the wall, and her face was the face of a woman doing arithmetic she has done 100 times and would like to have come out differently. Ilva, written of course, written and held up, and she looked at it and something in her went very tired. She wrote 9 days. Yes. She scraped it. She wrote and turned it round, and it was the only unkind thing she ever did to me, and she did it because I had earned it, and because she was 28 years old and had been sold. If you mean to send me back, tell me now, so that I do not have to learn it standing in front of 400 people. And I stood in a storeroom in a country where I could not speak, and I could not write no, because no would be scraped by Nim and filed by clerks and read by men who would then know the price of me, and I thought, the mills, the tithe, the Eastern March, what is any of it? I will write it now and let them have it and let them name their price. And then I thought, and this is the part I am most ashamed of, because it was true, and because it was still cowardice wearing the coat of statesmanship, and Fenlow's water goes with it, and her valley is drowned, and her uncle will make her pay for what I gave her. So I took my slate, and I wrote 9 days. And she read it, and she nodded slowly, and she scraped my slate clean for me, the way a servant would, and she handed it back and went out into the hall. That was the last thing I said to her in the silence. The thaw broke on the 11th of Crescent, in the 9th hour of the morning, and it broke as it always breaks. The ice on the cistern lifted and cracked with a noise like a gunshot, and by law that is the end of it, and by law nobody in Drumhello speaks a word for 1 hour more, until the king has stood in the open and made the first sound of the year. For 11 years I had made it. It is a formal thing. You go out and you say the year's name and the count of the dead, and you say Drumhello is loosed. And then the whole hold makes the loudest noise it can, all at once. And there are people who faint. And there are dogs who go mad. And there is not a person in this country who has not wept at that noise at least once in their life. This year I would say it with a treaty in my hand. They dug for the box at dawn. I had told nobody why. 12 men with shovels on the flank of the fallen slab where my tower had stood in the gray, and Holt Marram directing, and the snow gone to ice, and the ice gone to rotten waterlogged grain that came away in wet sheets, and I stood over them like a fool in my crown. They found the window seat at the 4th hour. They found the box at the 6th. It had been crushed, not broken open, crushed, the lid driven down onto the slates and the whole of it soaked through, and when Holt Marram put it in my hands, the water ran out of the seam. I carried it to the courtyard where 406 people were assembling to hear the year's name, and I set it on the mounting block, and I broke the lock with a shovel, and I opened it. 51 slates. Wax and pine. Wax which softens near a fire, and which a woman had held near a fire to smooth 11 times in a cold muniment room. Wax, under 60 feet of snow, and the snow becoming ice, and the ice pressing with the weight of a mountain for 31 days. They had gone smooth, every one of them. 51 blank slates, pressed clean and flat and glossy as a pond, and not one word on any of them. And I knelt on the wet stones of my own courtyard, and went through them one at a time like a man dealing cards, turning them over, looking at the backs, holding them to the light. Nothing, 90 days, nothing. Nim Sedge stood behind me with her hands over her mouth, and she is a slate keeper, and she has scraped 10,000 slates, and she understood before anybody in that courtyard what was in the box. Ilva was standing at the top of the hall steps. She had her cloak on and her bag at her feet, because she was a practical woman, and she had made the arithmetic come out and had not liked it, and her uncle's riders were at the gate with a spare horse. Behind her, 406 people. In front of me, the treaty in Tass's hands, open to the claws. Above us all, the drum with a great gray scar down its face where 22 feet of it had gone. And the hour ran out. I stood up with a blank slate in my hand. I have been alpha king of this basin for 19 years now, and I have made speeches to armies, and I have written a peace with a country I ruined, and I have never been afraid of anything the way I was afraid in that courtyard, because I had 90 days of true things in my chest, and the only way out of my chest was the one door I had spent my whole reign nailing shut. I looked at the box, I looked at her, and what came out of my mouth? The first sound made aloud in Drumhello in 90 days. The sound 406 people had waited a whole winter to hear. The sound that by law and by treaty should have been the year's name and the count of the dead and the vow that bound a kingdom. Was her name Ilva? I did not know what my own voice would be like. I had not heard it since the first frost. It came out cracked and low and wrecked, and it went up the front of the hall and rang off the stone, and 400 people flinched, and somebody's baby began to howl, and I heard the whole hold pull its breath in at once, the sound of a country remembering that sound exists. And in my skull, mid-syllable, the bell stopped. 90 days it had tolled. It stopped between one beat and the next, and left behind it a silence so enormous and so ordinary that I put my hand on the mounting block to keep my feet. She had gone white to the lips. She came down 2 steps. Ilva, I said again, because it was the only word I could find, and because I had wanted to say it since the 6th day, on a frozen bench with an old wolf between us. There were 51. I held up the blank slate. My hand was shaking. 19 years and my hands have never shaken except then. I wrote you every night. I locked them in a box because a slate in this hall is read by 4 men before morning, and I would not have my counsel learn what you were worth to me before you did. I told myself it was protection. It was not. It was politics, and you paid for it, and you have been standing in my house all winter believing you were for sale. Tass had the treaty open. He did not close it. He stood with it in his hands and let me hang myself in front of 400 people. The clause says I must speak the vow today or you go home and the water goes with you. My voice was coming back to me now, and it was too loud. Everything was too loud, 90 days of nothing, and now I could hear my own breath. I will not speak it yet. The whole courtyard moved. Brannock Wren's riders put their hands on their horses. Because a vow spoken to a woman who does not know what I withheld from her is not a vow, I said. It is a purchase. And your uncle wrote to you at midwinter that you must earn me, and I read it, because your uncle used a holed slate and did not scrape it, and I have carried that sentence in my mouth for 41 days with no way to spit it out. She had one hand on the stair rail. She had not moved. So the 51 first, I said, out loud in front of them, and then you may go home if you wish, and the water goes with you regardless. Tass, write it before witnesses now, because I will not have her choose me while she is holding a valley's thirst in her hands. Tass wrote it. I watched him do it. He wrote it on the treaty itself in the margin, in his own cramped hand, and he signed it, and the man who had spent 90 days building a case against her handed the pen to Holt Maram, who signed it too, and to Nim Sedge, who could not hold the pen steady, and it stands in my muniment room to this day with the watermarks still on it. And then I said them, all of them, 51 slates in a wet courtyard in a cracked voice, to 406 people who did not move. That the bell had begun under the gatehouse arch. That Ardle had called it fever and told me to write no woman's name. That I did not know what color her voice was and had lain awake in the deep of the silence trying to invent it. That I had watched her uncle wipe her words off with his thumb and had sat in the dark and done nothing. That she had been right about the wolves, and I had known she was right within 4 seconds of her saying it, and had spent 4 hours refusing to know it. That the mills, the tithe, the timber, and the Eastern March were nothing, and had been nothing since the 6th day, and that I would have burned the treaty in the first week if there had been any way at all to do it that did not end with a Fenlow child going thirsty. That there were 17 roofs under the water at Underfen, and that I had put them there. That I was sorry. I said that word out loud in my own courtyard, which no alpha king of Drumhello has ever done in the hearing of the hold, and it did not kill me. And at the end of it I had nothing left in my hands but a blank slate, and my crown was crooked, and I was hoarse from 90 days of disuse and 100 sentences, and I said, that is the whole of it. There is a horse at the gate. Nobody in this basin will think less of you for taking it, and if any man does, he will answer to me for the rest of his life. She came down the last of the steps. She crossed the wet stones of the courtyard in the silence of 400 people who had been given back their voices an hour before and could not find one of them. And she stopped in front of me, and she looked at the blank slate in my hand. And she said out loud, it sounds like a bell. Her voice, I had spent 90 nights building her a voice out of nothing. I had made it light, and then I had made it low, and then I had given up and decided I did not care. It was low and slightly rough at the edges, and unhurried, and it had a small dry lift at the end of a sentence, and it was the voice of the eyebrows going up one before the other. It was exactly what her silence had been, and I had heard it every day of that winter and had not once understood that I was hearing it. I put my hand over my mouth like a woman in a market. I am told this by everybody who was there. The Alpha King of Drumhello stood in his courtyard with his hand over his mouth. I said, she said, and her own voice broke apart on the second word, and she stopped and put her fist against her sternum and made herself go on. I said, it sounds like a bell, your voice. That's what you've had in your head all winter, Audrin. It isn't a fever. It's the only bell in Drumhello. You melted them all down, and you were carrying one. I don't know what it was, I said. Nor do I. Ardle said fever. My grandmother would have said the moon. I have no explanation, and I am not going to invent one, and I will not have it called destiny, because destiny is what men say when they want to be excused. I could not get my breath. It rang for one person. That is the whole of the evidence. Well, she said, it stopped. Yes. Then say the rest of it out loud, please, she said, because I have had 90 days of reading you, and I find I would like to be told. So I said the vow, not the treaty's vow. I did not know the treaty's vow. I had never learned it, having been told all my life that I would say it at 40 in a political marriage. What I said was hers, and it was 3 sentences long, and it named the wolves and the ledger and the marginal note and the 406, and I will not write it here, because I have found in 19 years that the only thing I own outright is the difference between what I say to my wife and what I write down for other people. She listened to it with her chin up. Then she said, yes. And Drumhello made the noise. I have heard it 19 times now, and it has never once been the same. That year it did not sound like joy, it went off like something breaking. 406 people who had watched their town go under in silence and had not screamed, screaming, the whole basin, the high pasture, the ruin of the lower hold, dogs unmuzzled and losing their minds. Nim Sedge on the steps with her mouth wide open and no sound coming out of it at all. Holt Marem bellowing at the gray scar on the mountain with the tears running into his collar. A 4-year-old girl on her mother's shoulders shrieking with her hands over her own ears, terrified and delighted. At the noise she was making, Tass rang the door hinges of the muniment room with the flat of his sword. And I stood in the middle of it, holding my wife's hands in the only quiet place in the country, and I could not hear one word she was saying to me. We rebuilt the lower hold on the eastern shelf, out from under the field. It took 4 years, and Tass costed it, and Ylva sighted it, and it has flooded twice. And she says a flood is a thing you can argue with and a slab is not, and she says it with a small, dry lift at the end. Holt Marem lay out on the wet snow for 9 winters and taught 11 wardens to feel a slab hold its breath. Brack died in his 5th spring after it in the sun on the wolf-run bench with his head on the boards, and Syl was a fool to the end of her days and never once read a slope correctly and was loved without reservation by every child in the hold. We keep wolves still. They are working animals. They are right about the snow they know, and they are honest about the snow they do not, which is more than the ledger was, and more than I was, and Holt writes their limits into the margin now, in a large, clear hand, so that no king 91 years from today can mistake a silence for a fact. The silence stands. Ylva has never asked me to lift it, and I have never offered, and once, the first winter after, with her hands wrapped round a cup and the frost thickening on the shutters, she said the only thing either of us has ever said about it that is worth writing down. She said that a country that cannot speak for 90 days learns exactly what it would have said, and that this is a terrible education, and that we should not waste it. We write to each other all winter, by choice. There is nobody to stop us now. I am 19 years king, and no clerk in this hold would dare scrape a slate of mine unread by me. And we do it anyway every night, the 2 of us at the same table with the lamp between us, cutting words into wax and turning them round. She has never once let me lock a slate in a box. And the 51 are on a shelf in her workroom, blank as they came out of the snow, propped up in a row where the light catches them. She has never let anyone put a word on them. Nim Sedge asked, once, whether the Queen would like them scraped and re-waxed and put back into service, and Ylva said no, and Nim asked why, since a blank slate is only a blank slate. I was in the doorway. I heard my wife say it out loud in her own voice, which I have never for one day stopped noticing. They aren't blank, that's the box of things he said out loud.